When I opened the bedroom door that night and saw him standing there, the hallway light casting a narrow golden line across his bare chest, I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel shame. I felt something far more dangerous, relief. Because for the first time in months, someone was looking at me like I still existed. His eyes weren't asking permission, but they weren't demanding either. They were waiting, quiet, steady, too knowing for his age. I should have said something. I should have told him to go back to his room. But instead, I froze, barefoot on the cold tiles, my heart beating in a rhythm I hadn't felt since I was 30. Maybe earlier. My breath caught when he stepped closer, but I still didn't move. Not away. Not forward. I just stood there and let the silence stretch between us like a string waiting to snap. And in that moment, I thought, not about consequences, not about my husband, not even about what this meant. I thought about how lonely I had become in my own house. And that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one. But before I tell you what happened that night, and what it led to, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt completely invisible in your own home, in your own skin, in your own marriage? If so, let me take you back to where it all began. It started the morning he arrived. The day itself was unremarkable, soft clouds hanging over the garden, the kettle whistling on the stove, the same cardigan slipping off my shoulder that I always forgot to mend. My husband had left early for a week-long trip, a conference in the city. He kissed me on the cheek, handed me the grocery list, and was gone before breakfast. The silence that followed was comforting, at first. I liked the quiet. I liked the absence of obligations, the pause in routine. Until the knock came. I opened the door to find him standing there with a bag slung over one shoulder and a crooked smile that didn't quite match the photo I remembered. He was older now, taller, with an edge of something, confidence, maybe, that hadn't been there the last time I saw him. I hadn't expected to feel anything. But I did. He greeted me like family, of course. A long hug that lingered just a moment too long. Nothing inappropriate, just long enough for me to notice the warmth of his skin through my thin blouse, and the way his voice dropped a little when he said my name. I showed him to the guest room, made the usual small talk. Let me know if you need anything. That sort of thing. He thanked me, dropped his duffel bag on the floor, and began unpacking as if he'd lived here all his life. By noon, the house felt different. It wasn't the presence of another body that unsettled me. It was the way he moved through the rooms. He wasn't loud or invasive. He was just present. Fully. As if he belonged. As if he'd been waiting to return. I tried to focus on tasks, laundry, cleaning out the spice cabinet, deleting old voicemails. But even when he wasn't in the same room, I felt aware of him. Of where he was. What he might be thinking. That afternoon, we had tea in the garden. It was warm enough for short sleeves, and I remember feeling self-conscious about my arms, the faint creases near my elbows, the skin a little looser than it used to be. I kept tugging at my sleeves. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did. He asked questions about my work, my routines, how I spent my time. The kind of questions my husband hadn't asked in years. I caught myself smiling. Actually smiling, not politely. It felt foreign and familiar all at once. As the sun lowered behind the trees, I went back inside and stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing dishes that didn't need rinsing. Through the window, I saw him picking at a branch, examining the leaves like a boy again. And for a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to be that curious again. To be looked at like something worth noticing. At dinner, we sat across from each other. My chair, his chair. The same ones we used when friends came over for wine and laughter. But this time, it felt private. His eyes lingered when I passed him the bowl of roasted vegetables. He didn't say anything suggestive. He didn't need to. The air was already thick with something unnamed. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs. My heart was beating faster than it should have. I told myself I was just tired. That I wasn't used to having company. That I missed my husband. That I loved him. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling fan as it turned in lazy, soundless circles. I thought about the way the guest room was just down the hall. About how strange it felt to be aware of someone else's footsteps in this house. And about the fact that I had applied lipstick before dinner, an old shade I hadn't worn in years. I hadn't meant anything by it. Or maybe I had. Around midnight, I heard him in the hallway. A soft shuffle, the creak of the floorboard near the stairs. I turned onto my side, eyes wide open, trying to steady my breath. He didn't knock. Didn't say a word. Just moved past my door. Still, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found a note on the counter. He'd gone for a run. I stared at his handwriting, neat and compact, and felt an ache in my chest that surprised me. A kind of longing I didn't recognize right away. Was I lonely? Yes. Had I felt invisible? Absolutely. But this was something different. This was awakening. Subtle. Dangerous. I made coffee and stared out the window again, watching the steam rise from the mug like breath. It felt like something had shifted inside the walls. Inside me. Something that couldn't be undone with routine or habit. By noon, I had changed outfits 3 times. Not because I was going anywhere. Just because I couldn't settle. My hands shook slightly when I pinned up my hair. My lipstick smudged. I reapplied it. When he returned, breathless and glowing from the run, he smiled at me and said, "You look different today." I laughed. Too quickly. He didn't push. Didn't comment further. But I caught his eyes dipping lower than they should have. Not in a disrespectful way. More like curiosity. Interest. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't look away. The days that followed blurred into a strange rhythm, filled with the kind of silence that wasn't empty but rather charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. I found myself paying attention to the smallest details, the sound of his footsteps as he came down the stairs, the way he stirred his coffee, the pause before he spoke. Everything he did felt deliberate, though he never crossed any lines. At least not yet. I tried to act normal. I folded laundry, wiped the counters, answered emails that didn't need answering. I stayed busy, but not present. My thoughts had taken on a life of their own. I wasn't fantasizing, at least, not in the way some might assume. It was more like anticipation. A quiet awareness of something shifting beneath the surface. On the second morning, we had breakfast together. I offered him eggs, which he declined, saying he preferred just coffee. I watched the steam curl above his cup and wondered if he noticed the way my hand trembled slightly when I reached for the milk. He didn't say anything, just offered a half smile, then changed the subject. Later, I suggested we run errands together. It felt innocent enough. He agreed easily, grabbing his jacket and following me out the door. We drove to the store with the windows cracked, soft air filtering in, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and dust. The kind of weather that made you nostalgic for something you couldn't quite name. In the car, our conversation felt effortless. He asked me questions, not superficial ones, but real ones. Things like, do you ever wish you'd done something else with your life, or what was your favorite age? Questions that made me think, made me pause before answering. I told him I used to love working with my hands, designing things, sewing. But that I gave it up long ago, when the routines of marriage and housework slowly took over. He listened. Really listened. And when he said, "That's a shame. You would have been good at it," I didn't know how to respond. My husband hadn't asked me a question like that in years. We walked through the aisles of the store slowly. I noticed the way he carried the heavier bags without being asked, how he reached for items before I could. These weren't romantic gestures, they were just considerate. But when you've been starved of attention, even kindness can feel like seduction. Back home, I offered him tea again, and we sat on the back porch. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows over the yard. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, but still felt cold. Not from the weather, but from the realization that I had been starving for connection, and now, for the first time in so long, someone was feeding that hunger. He watched the sky for a while before speaking. "You know," he said, "when I was younger, I always thought marriage would look different. Like something warmer." I glanced at him, unsure how to respond. He wasn't asking for agreement. He was just sharing. Still, the words hit a nerve. "That's not always how it goes," I said after a moment. "Sometimes it's more about stability." "Stability can be cold too," he said, not unkindly. I didn't argue. Because part of me agreed. That evening, I lingered longer than usual in the mirror. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, I told myself. Just curiosity. I noticed the way my blouse clung around my waist, the way a few strands of hair had gone silver near my temples. I touched my lips lightly, then turned off the light and went downstairs. He was already in the living room, reading. I sat across from him and picked up a book I had no intention of reading. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was full. At one point, he looked up and said, "You seem different lately." I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter," he said. "More alive." I looked away. It wasn't long after that we both stood, nearly at the same time, to turn in for the night. I moved toward the stairs. He followed a few steps behind. At the top, I paused. I didn't know why. Just instinct, maybe. He stopped beside me. Close. Too close. Our eyes met. And then, without a word, we kissed. There was no warning. No tension snapping into a dramatic crescendo. Just the quiet press of lips in a hallway dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp. Gentle. Real. Terrifying. I pulled away first. My breath came out in a rush. I turned, walked quickly to my room, closed the door behind me, and leaned against it, heart racing. What had I done? I didn't sleep. I replayed it over and over. Not the kiss itself, but the lead-up. The moments. The way I had stepped slightly toward him without realizing. The way my hands didn't shake when his touched mine. Morning came too quickly. I avoided his gaze at breakfast. Said little. Cleaned a counter that didn't need cleaning. He didn't press. Didn't mention it. And that made it worse, somehow. Like he knew I needed space to pretend nothing had happened. But something had. I thought of my husband. The weight of loyalty pressed heavy on my chest. And yet, what loyalty was I upholding, really? Was it loyalty to love? Or just to routine? To a version of me that no longer existed? I looked out the window at the garden, where new growth had started to sprout at the base of the hedge. It had been dead for months, or so I thought. And now, something green was emerging again. I didn't know what that meant yet. But I knew it meant something. I expected guilt to come crashing down on me the next morning like a wave I couldn't outrun. Instead, it was quieter, a dull, persistent ache that settled into my chest and stayed there. Not sharp, not even entirely painful. Just heavy. like carrying a secret I hadn't decided whether to keep or confess. He was already in the kitchen when I came down. He looked up briefly, met my eyes, and then turned back to the coffee. No words. No glances that lingered. It was as if nothing had happened. I poured my own cup in silence and sat at the far end of the table, sipping slowly, wondering if the silence was his way of giving me space or a wall he was building between us. I spent the morning folding laundry I'd already folded once, rearranging books on shelves, wiping windows that hadn't needed wiping in months. Every creak in the hallway made my stomach tighten. I avoided being alone with him, or at least I tried. But the house wasn't big enough for that, and the tension followed me from room to room like a shadow. Around noon, my husband called. He said the conference would go longer than expected and asked if I minded him staying 2 extra days. I told him of course not. I lied with such ease it startled me. My voice didn't even shake. After we hung up, I stood there holding the phone, staring at the wall, and wondered what had happened to me. That afternoon, I retreated into the garden. The wind had picked up and brought with it the scent of earth and distant rain. I sat under the large maple tree, trying to feel grounded. Trying to remember who I was before I felt this fracture inside me. But it was already too late for that kind of memory. Once something breaks, even if you patch it back together, the lines are still visible. You can't unsee the cracks. I heard footsteps behind me and didn't have to turn around to know it was him. He stood there a moment without speaking. Then, finally, his voice broke the silence. I shouldn't have done that. His tone was soft, not defensive. I didn't answer. He sat on the other end of the bench, not too close. His presence was careful. Measured. Like he was giving me the space to draw the lines now, if I still wanted to. After a pause, I said, "It wasn't just you." He didn't respond right away. Then, "I know." And that was all we said. There was something honest in the quiet, something heavier than any apology. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask for forgiveness. It only acknowledges the truth. Later that day, we went about things as if nothing had changed. I made dinner, and he helped set the table. We ate in near silence, the clinking of utensils the only sound. The walls felt closer than usual. The ceiling lower. It was as if the house had become aware of its own stillness, its own complicity in what had begun to unfold inside it. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours. I couldn't bring myself to undress. I stared at the floor, my thoughts swirling in tight, repetitive circles. How had I let this happen? More importantly, why had I let it? Because something in me had shifted long before his arrival. This wasn't about seduction. It wasn't about temptation. It was about the emptiness that had been echoing inside me for years. The kind that crept in slowly, disguised as contentment. And now that someone had noticed, truly noticed me, I couldn't pretend it wasn't real. The following morning, I left the house early and took a walk through the neighborhood. The streets were quiet. The air smelled like wet concrete and lilacs. I walked without purpose, just needing to move. To feel my body in motion. To remind myself that I was still in control of it. When I returned, he was in the living room, sketching in a notebook. I'd seen him doodle before, but this time I lingered, curious. He didn't hide the page. I saw the outline of a woman's figure, soft lines, gentle curves, drawn with surprising care. "You've always been good at that," I said, nodding toward the notebook. He looked up. "I don't draw people unless they make me feel something." I should have walked away. Instead, I sat on the arm of the couch, careful not to look directly at him. We didn't touch. We didn't speak. But in that silence, something passed between us again. Something wordless and dangerous. The phone rang, breaking the spell. I answered. It was my husband again, checking in, asking how things were. I told him everything was fine. I could hear the television in his hotel room in the background. The muffled sound of laughter. A life I used to feel part of. After the call, I turned to the sink and began washing dishes that didn't need it. He stood in the doorway behind me, not saying a word. I didn't ask him to leave. That evening, I found myself alone in the guest room. He had gone for a walk, or maybe he just needed space too. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing in the unfamiliar scent of his soap, the faint trace of something masculine and warm. I sat on the edge of his bed and looked around, at the suitcase in the corner, the neatly folded clothes, the sketchpad on the desk. None of it should have felt intimate. But it did. I left before he returned. I couldn't be there when he walked in. I wasn't sure what I'd do if he looked at me the way he had earlier. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house sounded louder. Every breath I took felt heavier. I had crossed something, not a line, exactly, but a threshold. And now, there was no going back. The next few days passed in a blur, marked not by events but by sensations. The house had become a kind of pressure chamber, where every look, every movement, carried weight. I found myself hyper-aware of everything, the way I stood near the stove, the position of his chair in the living room, the way the light from the kitchen spilled across the hallway at night. I avoided eye contact more often than not, yet found myself looking for him in every room. There was a shift, not just in me, but in him too. He grew quieter. Not distant, exactly, but more careful. He no longer lingered in doorways or brushed past me unnecessarily. He seemed to sense I was teetering between resistance and surrender, and he gave me the space to figure out which way I would fall. My husband called again on the third evening. His voice was cheerful, ordinary, filled with the safe mundanities of hotel rooms and conference schedules. I listened dutifully, answering when needed, offering appropriate murmurs. But my eyes wandered to the window, where I could see the reflection of the hallway behind me, lit by the soft glow of the wall lamp. In that reflection, I saw movement, a shadow passing quietly through the corridor, and I knew who it was. After the call ended, I didn't move from the kitchen. I stood at the sink, watching the darkness gather outside, wondering how many small decisions had led me here. There hadn't been one defining moment. It had been a series of silences. A collection of unmet needs. That night, I heard him in the hallway again. This time, he didn't pause. He simply passed by, footsteps soft and steady, and I felt something twist in my stomach, not fear, not even longing. Just the undeniable awareness that something irreversible had already begun. The next morning, I took my coffee outside. The air was sharp, cooler than it had been, and the grass was still wet with dew. I sat on the steps, holding the warm mug in both hands, and tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly at peace. It wasn't an easy memory to reach. He joined me a few minutes later, silent at first, then offering a quiet good morning. I nodded, not looking at him. We sat like that for a long time. Birds moved through the trees overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a neighbor started a lawnmower. The noise felt intrusive, pulling me back into the ordinariness of the world. Eventually, he broke the silence. "You don't have to talk about it," he said. "But I need you to know, I'm not expecting anything." I turned to him slowly, unsure what I would find in his expression. But it wasn't pressure I saw. It wasn't triumph or strategy. It was something else entirely. Restraint, maybe. Or guilt. I wasn't sure which of us it belonged to. I nodded once, then stood and went back inside. I needed space. Not just from him, but from myself. I threw myself into cleaning. The kind of cleaning that was more about distraction than necessity. I emptied drawers, sorted old photos, scrubbed behind appliances. My hands moved with mechanical precision, but my thoughts were a chaotic swirl of contradiction. In one drawer, I found a photo of my husband and me from our early years. We were laughing, caught in mid-motion, eyes crinkled at the corners. I stared at it for a long time, running my thumb over the worn edges, trying to summon the feeling that photo represented. But feelings fade. Not all at once, but in layers. Like the way color fades from fabric left in the sun too long. You don't notice until one day, the brightness is gone. That night, he stayed in his room. I heard music playing softly, something instrumental, melancholy. I stood outside his door for a moment, then forced myself to walk away. I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, the fan spinning in lazy circles. I remembered the way he'd looked at me on the porch. The way he hadn't pushed. That, somehow, made it harder. Because it wasn't manipulation. It was choice. Mine. The following afternoon, it rained. Hard. Sheets of water rolled down the windows, and the gutters overflowed. I watched it from the living room, the gray sky pressing low against the earth. The house felt dim, close. He walked in carrying a stack of damp firewood. I moved to help him, but he shook his head. "You'll get soaked," he said simply. I paused, then stepped back, wrapping the shawl tighter around my shoulders. He built the fire quickly, efficiently, his movements purposeful. When it caught and began to crackle, he sat on the floor, close to the hearth, rubbing his hands together. "You can sit," he said, without looking up. "You don't have to say anything." I hesitated, then lowered myself to the rug across from him. The fire warmed my legs, and for a moment, we sat in silence, facing each other, the flickering light painting shadows on the walls. I don't remember how long we sat like that. Time stretched. Shrunk. Warped. All I remember is the quiet. And the steady pulse of my heart. Later that evening, I cooked dinner. Something simple, roasted vegetables, pasta, salad. He offered to help, but I declined. I needed the rhythm, the motion, the small control it gave me. At the table, we ate in silence again. But this time, it wasn't avoidance. It was presence. The kind where words aren't necessary. That night, as I climbed into bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I studied the lines around my eyes, the slope of my shoulders, the slight tremble in my collarbone. I didn't look young. But I looked alive. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel invisible. The day began with a quiet stillness, the kind that felt too intentional to be coincidence. I opened the curtains and stared out at the garden, watching the leaves stir in the breeze, their motion soft and almost slow motion. The sky was a dull gray, not quite threatening rain but enough to keep the sun hidden. It matched the weight in my chest. I dressed with more care than I wanted to admit. I didn't choose anything overt, just a soft cream blouse that hugged my arms and a pair of fitted slacks I hadn't worn in months. They reminded me I still had a shape beneath all the layers of routine and compromise. I looked in the mirror longer than necessary, not out of vanity, but to study what had changed in my reflection. There was something sharper now. A tension behind the eyes, perhaps. Or maybe a flicker of awareness. He was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. His posture was relaxed, but there was a subtle alertness in his shoulders. He nodded when I entered, his gaze holding mine a second too long, and then he turned back to his mug. The radio hummed quietly in the background, an old jazz station playing something slow and mournful. I busied myself with breakfast I didn't really want, cracking eggs, slicing bread, organizing plates like a ritual that might restore order. He offered to toast the bread. I let him. Our fingers brushed when he reached past me, and the contact, though brief, sent a jolt up my spine that I tried to ignore. We ate with quiet civility, avoiding the elephant in the room not through denial, but through an unspoken agreement. If we didn't speak of it, maybe it would shrink. Maybe it would fade. But it didn't. It hovered, pulsing between us like a second heartbeat. Later that morning, he asked if I wanted to go into town. We needed a few groceries, and he offered to drive. I said yes without thinking, then immediately wondered if I should have hesitated longer. The drive was uneventful on the surface, light traffic, sleepy streets, the town going through its daily motions without drama. But inside the car, the air felt charged again. He kept one hand loosely on the steering wheel, the other resting on the console, fingers tapping in rhythm with the music. I noticed the way he glanced at me when I wasn't looking. Or maybe I was looking more than I realized. At the store, we separated briefly to grab different items, then met again at the checkout. He handed me a bottle of wine, raising an eyebrow. Thought you might want something for tonight. I almost said no. But instead, I took it from him and placed it in the basket. My silence said enough. Back at the house, I unpacked the groceries while he stepped outside for a call. I watched him through the kitchen window, pacing near the back gate, voice low but animated. I didn't try to eavesdrop. I didn't want to know who he was talking to. For now, he was here, and that was enough. The afternoon dragged. I tried to work on a crossword puzzle, but the words refused to come together. I tried to read, but my eyes kept slipping off the page. Eventually, I gave up and went to the garden, pruning dead leaves, watering soil that didn't need it. The sun had started to break through the clouds, but it only made the shadows sharper. He joined me a little later, gloves in hand, offering to help with the hedges. I handed him the shears without a word. We worked side by side for nearly an hour, the silence between us companionable, almost domestic. The kind of silence that once would have meant comfort. Now, it felt like the space before a decision. By the time we finished, the light had begun to shift toward evening. I turned toward the house, brushing soil from my hands, and he followed without question. Inside, I washed up, changed into a soft knit sweater, and poured 2 glasses of wine without asking if he wanted one. We sat in the living room, the fireplace unlit, the windows reflecting our silhouettes. The air between us had grown warmer, thicker. Not oppressive, but undeniable. He set his glass down first. I kept mine close, fingers circling the rim. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and said my name. Just once. No questions. No demands. Just the sound of it from his mouth, and somehow, that was enough. I set my glass aside and stood. Slowly. Deliberately. He didn't move at first. Just watched. Then he rose too. We didn't speak. There was no need. And then, we kissed It happened in the center of the room, in the quiet hush of twilight, with no music and no witnesses. There was no rush to it, no desperate hands or whispered declarations. Just a simple, mutual act that said more than any explanation could. When it ended, we didn't linger in an embrace. We stepped back, each of us standing in the thick silence that followed, breathing a little faster than before. He looked at me with something like apology in his eyes, but I didn't want that. Not now. I shook my head slightly, and he nodded, understanding passing between us without the burden of words. I turned and walked toward the stairs. He didn't follow. I didn't invite him. Upstairs, in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror. I didn't look like a woman who had just committed betrayal. I looked calm. Tired, maybe. But calm. I touched my lips, still tingling, and closed my eyes. This wasn't the end. And I knew that. The day after our kiss unfolded with a strange, deceptive normalcy. I moved through my morning routine with practiced efficiency, making the bed, folding laundry, preparing breakfast, but every movement carried a different weight. There was a layer beneath it all, something unsaid but undeniable. The quiet between us had changed texture. It was no longer charged with anticipation, but filled with aftermath. When I came downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, standing by the open window with a cup of coffee in hand. The breeze moved through his hair, and for a moment, he looked younger than usual, unguarded, almost peaceful. He turned his head when he heard my footsteps, offered a quiet good morning, and I responded in kind. Our eyes met, briefly, and then moved away. Nothing more. We didn't speak about what had happened. There was nothing to clarify. It had been simple in its execution but vast in its implication. The kiss had not been about seduction. It wasn't about conquest or infidelity in the cinematic sense. It was a confession, a silent one, exchanged through lips rather than language. Later that morning, I sat on the porch with a second cup of coffee, watching the wind play with the leaves along the edge of the yard. The garden had begun its slow transition from spring into summer. Buds were turning to blooms, and the edges of the hedges needed trimming again. Life moved forward, even when we didn't feel ready. He joined me not long after, taking the chair beside mine. He didn't sit too close. We didn't touch. But the space between us held something new. Not tension exactly. Not regret either. Just awareness. For a while, we said nothing. Then, as if gently nudging the air between us, he asked, "Is this something we pretend didn't happen?" I didn't answer right away. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of cut grass from a neighboring yard. I traced the rim of my cup with one finger and finally said, "I don't know." He nodded, as if he'd expected that. "I just don't want to make things worse for you." "You didn't," I said quietly. "Not on your own." He didn't respond, and we left it there. Throughout the day, I found myself watching him in subtle moments, the way he leaned against the counter while drying his hands, the quiet concentration with which he read the newspaper, the way he hummed under his breath while working in the yard. It was like witnessing someone I'd lived with in silence for years suddenly begin to take shape in full color. But that evening, something shifted again. It came as a simple call from my husband. He told me he'd finished early and would be driving home tomorrow instead of the following day. I said I was glad. I said I missed him. I didn't say that the words felt foreign in my mouth. After I hung up, the weight of that conversation settled into my chest. Everything would change again tomorrow. The balance I'd been navigating, however precarious, would be disrupted. The quiet cocoon of our days together, flawed, complicated, intimate, would end. I found him in the guest room later, folding a sweater into his bag. He looked up when I entered, eyes searching mine before settling. "He's coming back," I said. "I figured," he replied. "That's good." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "It's going to feel different." "I know." The simplicity of his response made something tighten in my throat. I wanted him to say something else. Something that would clarify what this all meant. But I knew that wouldn't be fair. We both knew this couldn't continue. It wasn't about punishment or guilt. It was about the boundary we were standing on and the consequences on either side of it. We ate dinner later in a kind of silence that was new again, not anticipatory or reflective, but final. As if we were quietly saying goodbye without saying the words aloud. I noticed how he passed me the salt without looking at me. How I thanked him without smiling. How the clink of our forks was the only sound in the room. After we finished, I washed the dishes while he wiped the table. Our hands moved in rhythm, just as they had the night before. But this time, the air felt colder. That night, I went to bed early. I lay on top of the covers, still dressed, staring at the ceiling. I could hear the creak of the stairs below, the closing of the guest room door, the hush of footsteps pacing once, then stopping. I thought about going to him. About opening my door and saying something. Anything. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because what would I say? That I didn't regret it? That I did? That I wished we had met at a different time, in a different world? All of it would have been true. And all of it would have been useless. I fell asleep sometime after midnight, my dreams fragmented and gray. In the morning, I woke to the sound of my husband's car pulling into the driveway. I sat up slowly, heart beating with a rhythm I hadn't felt in years, part dread, part adrenaline, part guilt. I went to the window and watched him get out, stretch, and look up toward the house. He smiled when he saw me through the glass and waved. I raised a hand in return. Behind me, the house was silent again. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something to break. The day unfolded with the same practiced rituals, breakfast, laundry, idle gestures of normalcy. But nothing about it felt normal. My husband was home. His presence in the house brought back a structure I had almost forgotten, his voice echoing down the hall, the sound of his shoes on the wood floor, the familiar way he cleared his throat before speaking. And yet, everything felt out of sync. I found myself watching him too closely. Not with affection, but with study. The way he read the newspaper while sipping his coffee. The way he laughed too loudly at his own jokes. The way he touched my shoulder when passing behind me, a gesture that used to be automatic but now felt distant, misaligned. I wondered how long he'd been on autopilot, and how long I'd been pretending not to notice. He asked about the house, about the garden, about the meals. Small, harmless questions that required nothing more than simple answers. I gave them to him. I smiled when expected. But under the surface, something taut had begun to fray. The guest room door remained closed most of the day. He stayed inside for the most part, emerging only briefly, to shower, to grab food, to slip out for a walk alone. My husband noticed his absence and commented on it. "Is he all right?" he asked casually, cutting into his toast. "Seems a little quiet." I shrugged. "Probably just tired." He accepted the answer with a nod and moved on. In truth, I hadn't spoken to him since the morning. We had exchanged only a glance when I passed the hallway, his eyes low, unreadable, his posture carefully neutral. He didn't force conversation. He didn't linger. It was as if he were giving me space now that my husband had returned, though I wasn't sure if the distance made it easier or harder. By mid-afternoon, the weight of pretending had begun to settle heavily on my shoulders. I took a walk alone, under the pretense of needing fresh air. I wandered past the edge of our neighborhood, along the narrow trail that curved behind the trees. My steps were slow, deliberate, as if each one was buying me a little more time before returning to the reality I was now trying to navigate. I thought about the moment in the living room, the second kiss. I thought about the softness of it, the clarity it brought, and the consequences that now hung between all of us, unspoken but alive. I thought about how quiet he had been that morning, how carefully he avoided being in the same room as the two of us. And I thought about how much of that was for my benefit. When I returned, the house was quiet again. My husband was on a call in the study. I heard the murmur of his voice through the door, the cadence familiar and grounding in its own way. I moved past quickly, not wanting to linger. In the kitchen, I stood still for a long time, my hands resting on the counter. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, an idea, a spark of courage, or just permission to exhale. The silence of the room felt thick, like it knew too much. And then I heard footsteps behind me. Light, steady, pausing just outside the doorway. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. "Do you have a minute?" he asked quietly. I nodded once, still facing the sink. He didn't enter. He waited for me to follow, which I did after a moment's hesitation. We walked in silence to the back patio. The sky was clear now, pale blue with streaks of evening cloud. The light was beginning to soften. Everything looked golden. We stood apart, each of us leaning against opposite ends of the railing. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said after a pause. I felt the words land before I processed them. My body went still. "My flight's early," he added. I didn't want to go without saying something. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze. "This wasn't fair to you," he continued. "Any of it." I looked down at my hands. "You weren't the only one responsible." He gave a small, dry laugh. "I know. But I complicated things. And you're the one who has to live in the middle of it now." "I already was," I said. "Long before you showed up." Silence stretched again, but this time it felt final. He stepped away from the railing, walking toward the door, then paused. "Whatever happens, I don't regret knowing you differently. Even if it was brief." I nodded again. That was all I could offer without crumbling. That night, after dinner, my husband suggested we watch a movie together. We sat side by side on the couch, his arm draped over the backrest, his hand occasionally brushing my shoulder. I responded when I could. I smiled when the movie called for laughter. I leaned into his side when he looked at me expectantly. But inside, I was somewhere else. And later that night, we spent the night together. It wasn't passion that guided me. It wasn't guilt either. It was duty. Familiarity. A need to feel tethered to something recognizable. My body moved on instinct, my mind only half present. I thought, for brief seconds, of the other room down the hall, quiet, dark, occupied by someone who was now a part of my story whether I liked it or not. When it was over, I lay awake long after my husband drifted to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the house, the soft tick of the clock on the nightstand. Everything was still. Everything was unchanged. And yet, nothing was the same. I closed my eyes and tried to forget the shape of the silence that had passed between us earlier. But I couldn't. It was carved into me now. The morning began before the sun had fully risen. The light in the room was soft and gray, and for a brief moment, I had forgotten what day it was. I reached across the bed, but the other side was empty. My husband had already gotten up. I sat there a moment, letting the stillness settle around me like a blanket. Then I remembered. He was leaving today. Not my husband. Him. I got dressed slowly, my movements deliberate. I chose a simple outfit, something unassuming. I didn't bother with makeup, didn't touch my hair. It felt wrong to perform any kind of ritual for this. Nothing about today felt ceremonial. It felt unfinished. Downstairs, my husband was already reading the paper. The coffee machine whirred beside him, its steady hum oddly soothing in its routine. He greeted me with a smile and asked if I slept well. I said yes. I didn't ask if he had. We sat in quiet companionship, the way long married couples do, with an understanding of each other's rhythms but none of each other's thoughts. I took small sips of coffee and watched the light shift through the window. He hadn't come down yet. I could feel it, his presence still upstairs, still packing, still preparing to disappear. At some point, my husband rose to shower, and I took the chance to slip away from the kitchen. I moved silently through the hallway, down toward the guest room, and paused at the door. It was ajar. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, tying his shoes. Our eyes met. There were no words exchanged, not right away. The air felt too fragile. I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, though not all the way. "You're early," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Didn't sleep much," he replied. "Figured I'd just get it over with." He looked around the room then, as if trying to memorize it. As if he could take something tangible with him. But this house wasn't his. And it never would be. "I don't know what to say," I said honestly. He shook his head. "You don't have to say anything." But I did. I had to. "Thank you," I said, and his expression softened, confusion flickering behind his eyes. "For what?" "For seeing me. For not pretending I wasn't fading." He looked at me for a long time. "You weren't fading. You were just quiet." That made something twist deep in my chest. I felt the sting of unshed tears, but I didn't let them rise. This wasn't a moment for tears. This was a moment for silence, for clarity, for finishing what had already been unraveling. He stood then, slinging the bag over his shoulder. We were standing a foot apart, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the gravity of the space between us. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too." He gave a single nod, then walked past me and out the door. I didn't follow. I heard the front door open, the muted exchange of voices, my husband, bright and cheerful, him, quieter, polite. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as the sound of the door closing marked his departure. He was gone. I returned to the kitchen a few minutes later. My husband was still by the door, locking it behind him. When he saw me, he smiled again and said, "Nice guy. Shame he had to leave early." I nodded and began clearing the coffee mugs. The rest of the morning passed in dull motions. I dusted the shelves, rearranged the fruit bowl, answered a few emails that didn't matter. I moved through the house like someone trying to wear the skin of her old self. But it didn't fit the same way. By early afternoon, the light had changed again. The house felt quieter now, even though nothing was tangibly different. My husband was reading in the living room. I sat across from him, pretending to be engrossed in a book. My eyes never reached the end of the paragraph. At some point, he looked up and said, "You've been quiet lately." I met his gaze. "Just tired, I think." He nodded. "Understandable." And that was it. That evening, we had dinner as usual. I cooked. He poured the wine. We spoke about the news, about a neighbor's new car, about whether the tomatoes in the garden needed replanting. It was the language of familiarity, the performance of routine. But beneath it, something had shifted. When the dishes were done and the lights were dimmed, we went to bed like we always did. He drifted off quickly, his breath deepening beside me. I lay on my back, eyes open, watching the ceiling for something that never came. My thoughts drifted to the guest room, now empty, the bed smoothed, the air still faintly carrying his scent. I wondered if he had looked back before leaving. I wondered if I had missed the last chance to say something more. But mostly, I wondered who I would be in the morning. Because this part, this silence, this return to normal, was the hardest of all. The days that followed his departure unfolded with a disorienting rhythm, like a song whose tempo kept slipping out of sync. I moved through each morning as if on autopilot, performing the same routines I had always performed, making coffee, folding the throw blankets on the sofa, watering the plants by the window, but every action felt like it belonged to someone else's life. A life that no longer quite fit me. My husband returned fully to his routines, as if the brief disruption had never occurred. He asked how the week had gone, and I told him what I could without lying. Yes, the house was quiet, yes, the garden was looking better, yes, I was glad he was home. All true, and yet entirely incomplete. The truth had no place in those conversations. We sat together in the evenings again, watching television shows we'd both long ago stopped paying attention to. We spoke over dinner, often in overlapping fragments, about unimportant things, the weather, the neighbors, the news. There was a kind of comfort in it, I suppose, though it felt more like familiarity than connection. But inside me, something had shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a plate beneath the surface of the earth, moved just enough to create tension that would never fully settle again. I found myself waking in the middle of the night. Not from dreams, there were none, but from a heaviness in my chest. I would lie there beside my sleeping husband, staring at the ceiling in the dark, wondering if he sensed it too. The change. The undercurrent. The version of me that had returned to this bed wasn't the same as the one who had kissed him goodbye weeks ago. I began avoiding the guest room. I kept the door closed, the lights off. Once or twice, I stood in front of it, hand resting on the doorknob, unsure what I expected to find. Maybe a trace of him left behind. A forgotten belonging. A reason to step inside. But I never opened it. I wasn't ready. Or maybe I was too late. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, I found a folded piece of paper lodged between the cushions of the armchair. It was from a sketchpad, rough edges, smudged charcoal, and it bore the outline of a woman's back, seated in profile, her shoulders slightly hunched as if from cold or exhaustion. The posture was unmistakably mine. I held it for a long time, fingers trembling only slightly. He must have drawn it without me knowing, perhaps during one of those evenings we'd sat in the same room not speaking. I didn't show it to my husband. I didn't throw it away either. I tucked it into a drawer in my closet, beneath a stack of old scarves I hadn't worn in years. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. I began to notice small shifts in my husband. Nothing overt, just brief pauses in conversation, moments where his eyes would linger a second too long, an occasional question delivered with too much casualness. One morning, as he drank his coffee, he said, "He didn't leave anything behind, did he?" The question was innocent enough. But I heard something in it, something heavier beneath the surface. "No," I answered. He packed light. He nodded and didn't ask anything else. But the silence that followed sat between us like an unopened envelope. A week later, I overheard him speaking on the phone in the study. I hadn't meant to listen, had simply passed the door at the wrong moment, but I heard my name. And his tone was softer than usual, tinged with something between worry and resignation. I kept walking, pretending I hadn't heard, pretending everything was still in place. That evening, we had dinner together like always. But afterward, when I went to clear the plates, he stopped me. "Sit a minute," he said. I did. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You've been somewhere else lately." I opened my mouth, then closed it. I couldn't deny it. I couldn't admit it either. "I know I've been distant," he said quietly. "Maybe for a long time. I thought we were comfortable. That was enough." I looked down at my hands. "I'm not angry," he added. "But I can feel it. That something's changed." Still, I didn't speak. Because what was there to say? That he was right? That yes, something had cracked open inside me, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't fold it back into place? He sighed and stood. The conversation ended there. And yet, it hadn't really begun. That night, I returned to the guest room for the first time. I opened the door slowly, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The room was clean. Unremarkable. The bed was made, the windows shut, the air faintly stale from disuse. I stood there a long time, letting the memories settle around me, not chasing them away this time. I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel it all. The confusion. The shame. The longing. The strange clarity that had come in his absence. I had wanted something to change. And it had. But not in the way I had expected. I no longer felt lost. I no longer felt invisible. But I wasn't sure that what I had become was something better. Only something else. When I left the room, I didn't close the door behind me. I let it stay open. Just a little. There is an illusion that time will restore what it has taken, or at least dull the sharpness of what was lost. In the weeks that followed, I tested that illusion every day, hoping the ordinary rhythms of life would wear down the edges of memory, smooth over the fractures I had made. But some things, I learned, settle deeper with time. They become part of the house, part of the way sunlight slants through the kitchen window, part of the hush that falls in the evenings when words run out and only silence remains. Our life, outwardly, resumed its familiar routine. My husband returned to his projects, his meetings, his small daily comforts. I took to walking in the mornings, circling the neighborhood before the streets grew busy, letting the air clear my mind. Sometimes I passed the bus stop, or the old library, or the corner bakery, places I had frequented for years, but which now felt foreign, as if the version of myself who had walked those streets had faded into someone I only recognized from photographs. I grew skilled at hiding the change inside me. I smiled when I was supposed to, responded when spoken to, kept up with friends and family who never guessed at the turbulence beneath my surface. They asked about the house, the garden, my husband's work, my own quiet hobbies. I answered, and in answering, maintained the fiction that nothing had altered. But I had changed. Irrevocably. My sense of self, so long built around stability, reliability, the slow, steady accretion of years, had shifted, as if a fault line had opened beneath my feet. Some mornings, I woke feeling raw and exposed, everything too sharp and too bright. Other days, I felt oddly serene, a sense of calm acceptance settling into my bones. My husband, for his part, seemed content to let the old patterns stand. He was gentle, attentive in the ways he had always been, setting out my favorite mug, remembering to buy the bread I liked, filling the bird feeders outside the kitchen window. Yet even his kindness felt different now. Less like partnership, more like habit. He didn't speak again of what he sensed, and I never offered any explanation. Our intimacy was not rebuilt, but replaced with something quieter, a kind of truce, or maybe just fatigue. I did not see him again, the one who had left the guest room, though his absence echoed in unexpected ways. Sometimes I found myself glancing toward the end of the hall, expecting a door to open, a familiar step on the stairs. Sometimes, when the house was still, I almost imagined I could hear the faint scratch of a pencil on paper, or the brief hush before a question was asked. I returned to the sketch he left only once, months later. I unfolded it slowly, tracing the lines with my eyes, seeing not just myself but the person I had briefly become, vulnerable, exposed, alive in a way I had not been for decades. I cried then, quietly, in the stillness of my closet, not from regret but from recognition. For a moment, I let myself remember, not just the mistake, but the feeling of being seen. Summer crept in, filling the house with heat and the hum of distant lawnmowers. The garden flourished, blooms rising and fading in their turn. I tended it alone most days, content with the dirt beneath my nails and the slow, patient work of growth and repair. I found solace in small things, the arc of water from the hose, the cool shade of the porch, the pattern of clouds drifting over the roofline. One afternoon, my husband joined me in the garden. He brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, handed me one without a word. We sat together on the steps, looking out at the beds of flowers, the neat rows of tomatoes, the riot of color that softened the edge of the lawn. After a long silence, he said, "You seem different these days." I considered denying it, but instead I only nodded. "That's not always a bad thing," he added. I looked at him, trying to see him as he was now, not just as he had been all these years. There was a kindness in his expression, a willingness to accept what could not be undone. "I know," I said softly. We sat like that for a long time, the evening gathering around us, the light slowly thinning to dusk. Life resumed. It changed. It healed in some places and scarred in others. But always, it moved forward. I am not who I was before. I do not know if I am better, or wiser, or only more complicated. But I am real, raw in places, gentle in others, awake to the way longing and grief can shape a life. And though there are days when regret whispers at the edges of my mind, there are others, more and more, as time goes on, when I am grateful. Not for what happened, but for the reminder that even in the most settled lives, there are new beginnings, waiting quietly, just beneath the surface. This is where my story ends. Not with answers, but with acceptance. With the quiet knowledge that we carry our secrets not as burdens, but as parts of the selves we become.